A German shepherd puppy sat alone beneath the cold shelter lights, too weak to bark, too frightened to eat, and only hours away from being put down. Known only as Case K619, he had already stopped looking toward the door. Across Staunton, a wounded Navy SEAL was preparing to sell his father's house and return to a life that no longer felt like his own. Then, one urgent phone call brought the soldier to the shelter. Why did the puppy reach through the bars and catch his uniform sleeve? Would the Navy SEAL walk away, or carry one more broken soul home? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late autumn had settled over Staunton, Virginia, with a pale sky, restless wind, and the sharp smell of rain gathering beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. Brown leaves scraped along the pavement outside the Shenandoah County Animal Center, where every kennel was occupied and every empty corner had been turned into temporary storage. Inside, the building carried the nervous music of an overcrowded shelter, barking dogs, rattling gates, ringing telephones, and the hurried footsteps of people trying to make too few resources stretch across too many lives. At the end of the canine wing, however, one kennel remained strangely quiet. The card clipped to its metal door read K619. Behind the bars lay a 9-week-old German shepherd puppy with an underweight body, oversized paws, and black and tan fur that should have been soft but instead clung to his narrow frame in dull, uneven patches. One ear had begun to rise while the other folded sideways, giving him the appearance of listening to two different worlds. The shelter staff had started calling him Scout, though he showed no sign that he understood the name. He did not bark when people approached. He did not chase toys, lift his head at the sound of food, or press his nose toward the hands offered through the bars. Scout spent most of each day curled against the back wall, as though he had learned that the safest way to survive was to occupy as little space as possible. He had been discovered 3 weeks earlier, inside an abandoned machinery shed outside the county line. The building had once housed an illegal breeding operation. Rusted cages stood beneath a leaking roof, and torn feed sacks had been scattered across the floor. By the time investigators arrived, most of the dogs had already been removed or abandoned elsewhere. Scout had been found alone in the smallest cage, too weak to stand for more than a few seconds. No one knew whether his mother had been taken, sold, or had simply disappeared before help came. The shelter had treated dehydration, parasites, and a respiratory infection, but the puppy's body remained fragile, and his spirit even more so. He ate only enough to remain alive. He avoided eye contact. Whenever a metal bowl struck the concrete floor, he flattened himself so completely that even experienced workers found it difficult to watch. Ruth Bennett stood outside his kennel, with a clipboard held against her faded green coat. At 71, Ruth was a retired veterinary technician with a compact build, weathered fair skin, and silver hair cut neatly at her jaw. Her blue eyes were direct but not unkind, and 34 years of assisting frightened animals had taught her that urgency and panic were not the same thing. Ruth spoke gently to nervous dogs, firmly to careless people, and with very little patience to anyone who confused paperwork with compassion. She now volunteered with a small rescue network that found foster homes for animals requiring more time than public shelters could provide. Unfortunately, every foster family on Ruth's list was already full. The paper on her clipboard gave Scout's final medical review and the shelter's decision. His condition had not improved enough. The kennels were beyond capacity. No rescue placement had been confirmed. Humane euthanasia was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Ruth looked through the bars. "You have terrible timing, little man," she murmured. Scout did not move, but the tip of his folded ear twitched. Ruth stepped into the hallway and pulled an old number from her phone. She had not called Ethan Cole in nearly 2 years. At 39, Ethan was a Navy SEAL whose career had been shaped by discipline, danger, and the belief that hesitation cost lives. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with short, dark brown hair, beginning to show gray near the temples, a strong, angular face, and a closely trimmed beard that softened very little of his guarded expression. A pale scar ran beneath his left ear, while an older line crossed the back of one hand. Ethan had once been easy with other people, Ruth remembered. The kind of man who listened before speaking and quietly carried the heaviest equipment without making a performance of it. A shoulder injury during a training accident and partial hearing loss in his left ear had changed that ease. Months of treatment had left him impatient with sympathy and suspicious of silence. He was staying temporarily in his late father's house across town, sorting tools, furniture, and 40 years of memories into boxes before a medical board decided whether he could return to active duty. When Ruth called, Ethan was standing in the garage beside an open cardboard carton marked "Keep," though almost nothing had gone into it. He wore a clean Navy working uniform Type 3, the soft green, gray, brown camouflage, unarmored and practical, with no tactical gear. The uniform was not required that day. Ethan had put it on because it belonged to a life with rules, while the house around him belonged to questions. "I need 48 hours," Ruth said after he answered. Ethan pressed the phone closer to his right ear. "For what?" "A German Shepherd puppy." "No." "You have not heard the situation." "I heard enough." Ruth explained the overcrowded shelter, the puppy's condition, and the deadline. Ethan stared at his father's workbench, where every screwdriver still hung in order above the same scratched wooden surface. His shoulder throbbed beneath the fabric of his uniform. "I am selling this house," he said. "I may be leaving Virginia next week. I cannot take responsibility for a dog." "I am not asking for forever." "That is what people say before 48 hours becomes a month." Ruth knew better than to argue with the part of Ethan that had already built a wall. "Then come drive us to the rescue facility. My van is in the shop. You can leave him there and return to your boxes." Across the street from Ethan's house, Helen Carter was opening her mail at a small kitchen table polished smooth by 52 years of meals. Helen was 78, tall and slender despite a slight curve in her back, with warm brown skin, soft gray curls pinned loosely behind her head, and dark eyes that seemed capable of noticing every sadness except her own. A former elementary school music teacher, Helen had spent her life coaxing shy children into singing loudly enough to hear themselves. Since her husband's death 3 years earlier, she had become quieter, though never less observant. The final envelope bore the seal of the Staunton Community Services Board. Helen read the letter twice. Willow House, the senior center where she volunteered, needed immediate roof repairs and a replacement heating system. Without funding, the building could close before winter ended. Helen folded the notice carefully and slipped it inside an old hymnal on the counter. The book closed over the letter with a soft thump. It was a foolish hiding place, and Helen knew it. Still, grief had taught her that people often concealed frightening truths not because they believed the truths would disappear, but because they needed one ordinary afternoon before facing them. Less than an hour later, Ethan pulled into the shelter parking lot. Ruth met him at the entrance and led him down the crowded corridor. Ethan kept his jaw tight as dogs barked from both sides, the overlapping sounds striking his damaged hearing in hard, distorted bursts. When they reached K619, Scout remained against the wall. "That puppy cannot travel 2 states in this condition," Ethan said. "The other rescue can stabilize him. If he survives the trip." Ruth studied him. "That is why I asked for 48 hours. Ethan turned away. He had seen this maneuver before. Place the vulnerable thing close enough, then wait for duty to overcome good judgment. He had spent most of his adult life entering situations other people were trying to escape. He would not be recruited by a silent puppy and a woman who knew precisely which part of his conscience to press. Then something touched his sleeve. Ethan looked down. Scout had crossed the kennel without making a sound. One thin foreleg extended through the bars, and a small claw had caught in the fabric near Ethan's wrist. The puppy was still crouched low, ready to retreat, but his dark brown eyes were fixed on the man before him. Ethan did not reach through the gate. He simply stood there while Scout held on. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the kennel marked K619 was empty. Ethan carried the German Shepherd puppy outside beneath his uniform jacket, while Ruth followed with medicine, food, and a folded blanket. Scout had not been saved, not yet. He had only been given one more night. The rain reached Staunton before evening, tapping lightly against the windows of the old coal house, while the last brown leaves gathered along the porch steps. Ethan carried Scout inside beneath his navy jacket, careful not to press the puppy against his injured shoulder. The house smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and the machine oil his father had used on every stubborn hinge and rusted tool. Nothing had changed since Ethan's childhood, except the silence. His father's boots were still beneath the coat rack, one leaning against the other as if the old man had stepped out only moments earlier. Ethan avoided looking at them. He took Scout through the kitchen and into the narrow laundry room, where he had arranged a folded blanket, 2 stainless steel bowls, and a shallow cardboard box lined with towels. The setup was clean, warm, and practical. Ethan had built temporary sleeping positions in worse places with less time. Yet when he lowered the 9-week-old German Shepherd puppy onto the blanket, Scout remained rigid beneath his hands. The puppy's thin black and tan body looked even smaller inside the unfamiliar room. One ear stood uncertainly while the other folded toward his cheek, and his oversized paws spread against the floor as if searching for something solid enough to trust. Ethan backed away, expecting Scout to inspect the water or at least smell the food Ruth had packed. Instead, Scout slipped past his boot, crossed the kitchen, and vanished behind the mustard-yellow sofa in the living room. Ethan stood with both hands on his hips and listened to the faint scrape of claws beneath the furniture. "That is not your bed," he said. His voice was not loud, but Scout flattened himself against the wall. Ethan could see only one dark eye and the edge of a narrow muzzle through the gap beneath the sofa. During years with the Navy SEAL teams, Ethan had worked around military working dogs trained to move through noise, darkness, and confusion without losing focus. Those dogs understood hand signals, routines, and firm voices. They waited for instructions because instructions made the world predictable. Scout seemed to have learned the opposite lesson. Every command sounded like danger. Every movement carried the possibility of being seized. Ethan set the food bowl several feet from the sofa and sat in a chair where the puppy could see him. "Eat," he said. Scout did not blink. Ethan waited 10 minutes, then 20. The pain in his shoulder deepened into a hard pulse. He finally stood, placed the water beside the food, and went upstairs to find a clean shirt. When he returned, neither bowl had been touched. The first night passed badly for both of them. Ethan tried to sleep in his old bedroom, but the room felt crowded with memories despite being nearly empty. His father's framed photograph remained on the dresser. Thomas Cole, at 68, broad through the chest even after retirement, with iron-gray hair, a square jaw, and the stern expression of a man who had believed affection was best expressed by repairing things before anyone noticed they were broken. Ethan had inherited the same habit. He had repaired doors, radios, vehicles, and injured men. He had never learned what to do with a life that could not be fixed by tightening the right bolt. A truck changed gears on the wet street outside, and Ethan woke with his heart racing before he had fully fallen asleep. The sound entered unevenly through his damaged left ear, distorted and directionless. For one breathless second, he did not know where he was. He sat upright, reached automatically toward the nightstand, and found no weapon there, only his hearing device, a bottle of pain medication, and his father's old alarm clock. Downstairs, Scout remained silent. That silence bothered Ethan more than barking would have. He carried his blanket to the living room and slept in the armchair with his duffel bag at his feet. Near noon the following day, Helen Carter crossed the street beneath a dark blue umbrella, carrying a heavy pot wrapped in a kitchen towel. Her tall, slender frame leaned slightly into the wind, and silver curls escaped from the loose pins at the back of her head. Helen wore a plum-colored wool coat and sensible black shoes, polished more carefully than the weather deserved. She had spent 40 years teaching children that a shaky voice could still hold a tune, and that belief had followed her into old age. Even so, grief had made her cautious about entering other people's quiet. She knocked twice before Ethan opened the door. His beard was neatly trimmed, but shadows darkened the skin beneath his eyes. He was no longer wearing his uniform, only a gray thermal shirt and dark work pants, though his posture remained so straight that the doorway seemed narrower around him. "Chicken soup," Helen announced. "I made too much," which is what lonely people say when they do not wish to admit they cooked for company. Ethan took the pot before she could drop it, though the movement made his shoulder tighten. Helen noticed. She also noticed the unopened duffel bag beside the armchair, the folded blanket, and the fact that the stairs appeared untouched. "Where's the puppy?" she asked. Ethan pointed toward the sofa. Helen lowered herself slowly into a wooden chair, leaving several feet between her shoes and the furniture. She did not crouch, call Scout's name, or reach underneath. "Some creatures dislike introductions," she said. "Your father was one of them." "My father disliked most conversations." He disliked conversations he had not prepared to win. Ethan almost smiled, but the expression disappeared before it fully formed. Helen stayed long enough to drink half a cup of coffee and explain that the soup contained too much celery because her late husband had once claimed celery could cure every illness except bad judgment. She did not mention the letter hidden inside the hymnal across the street. She did not tell Ethan that Willow House might close before winter ended, or that 23 elderly residents depended on its lunch program. There were truths people carried like hot dishes, carefully with both hands, waiting for a table strong enough to receive them. That afternoon, Helen's daughter called from Florida. Claire Carter was 52, a practical woman with auburn hair cut to her shoulders, lightly freckled skin, and the brisk voice of someone who organized her worries into lists. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice and had inherited her father's belief that every problem became smaller once a form had been completed. "The house is too much for you," Claire said. "There is a 2-bedroom place near us, ground floor, no stairs. I sent pictures." "I saw them." "And?" "The kitchen looks as if no one has ever burned a pie in it." "That is not a reason to stay alone in Virginia." Helen looked toward the empty chair across her table. 3 years earlier, her husband had sat there each morning, pretending not to read the newspaper over the rim of his glasses. "I am not alone," she said. Claire was quiet long enough for both women to recognize the lie, though neither challenged it. After the call ended, Helen touched the closed hymnal. The letter inside seemed heavier than paper had any right to be. By the second evening, Scout still had not eaten. Ethan tried moving the bowls, warming the food, softening it with water, and placing a trail of small pieces toward the sofa. He used short commands, then gentler ones. The puppy only retreated farther into shadow. Frustration rose in Ethan with the old, familiar heat of a mission slipping beyond control. Then he saw Scout trembling, not defiant, not stubborn, terrified. Ethan remembered men who had returned from danger unable to enter crowded rooms, sleep without lights, or trust doors that closed behind them. No one had called those men disobedient. He removed the bowls, turned off the overhead light, and sat on the floor with his back to the sofa. He took a polishing cloth from his duffel and began cleaning an old pair of navy boots, moving slowly enough that every sound could be understood. After several minutes, he hummed a simple melody his mother had sung during summer power outages, when thunder rolled over the mountains and candlelight made the kitchen feel like a ship at sea. Ethan had not remembered the song in years. Behind him, something shifted. He did not turn. Morning arrived, pale and cold. Ethan woke in the armchair and looked toward the food bowl. Half of it was empty. Scout remained hidden behind the sofa, but one dark sock had disappeared from beside Ethan's boots. A small black nose rested near the edge of the furniture, guarding the stolen treasure. Ethan picked up his phone and called Ruth. "How was the night?" she asked. He looked at the half-empty bowl, then at the sock beneath Scout's chin. Give me another week." Ruth did not laugh. She had lived long enough to know that the promises most likely to change a life rarely began with forever. They began with one more night, one more meal, or one more week. By the third week, winter had begun testing the edges of Staunton. Frost silvered the lawns before sunrise. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood dark beyond the bare trees, and the old coal house seemed to breathe differently now that another living creature occupied it. Ethan no longer measured Scout's progress by full meals or obedient responses. He measured it in inches. On the 8th morning, a black nose appeared from beneath the mustard-yellow sofa while Ethan read the newspaper on the floor. On the 10th, 2 oversized paws rested beyond the shadow, though the puppy's narrow body remained hidden. By the end of the 2nd week, Scout would come out long enough to drink, provided Ethan kept his back turned and made no sudden movement. The improvement was so small that most people might have missed it. Ethan did not. Years as a Navy SEAL had trained him to notice changes others dismissed. A door left slightly wider than before, a voice that became too careful, silence where there should have been ordinary noise. Yet Scout was teaching him that observation was not the same as control. Sometimes noticing a frightened creature meant resisting the urge to act. Ethan began keeping a notebook beside the armchair. Metal striking concrete, Scout flattened himself. A door closing sharply, Scout fled behind the sofa. A hand reaching from above, the puppy lowered his head and trembled. A calm voice from several feet away, one ear turned toward the sound. Ethan had seen men return from difficult deployments, carrying invisible maps of danger inside them. They knew which smells, sounds, and shadows could open doors to places they had tried to leave behind. No one expected those men to heal because someone repeated a command loudly enough. Scout deserved the same patience. The routine changed. Ethan stopped approaching the sofa. Each morning he sat on the rug with coffee and the local paper, leaving food near the edge of the room. He read certain articles aloud, not because Scout understood county budgets or high school football, but because the steady rhythm of a familiar voice filled the silence without demanding anything from it. Ethan learned that Scout preferred shredded chicken mixed with warm water, disliked the hum of the vacuum cleaner, and watched dust floating in sunlight with solemn fascination. The puppy's humor emerged quietly. He stole one sock at a time and carried it beneath the sofa, building a collection that had no practical purpose. He once crept toward Ethan's boot, sniffed it for nearly a minute, then sneezed so violently that he frightened himself backward. Ethan laughed before he could stop. Scout vanished into hiding, but reappeared 10 minutes later. That return mattered more than the laugh. On a cold Tuesday morning, Helen Carter appeared at the door wearing a rust-colored coat and carrying a toolbox that looked older than Ethan.
"Willow House has a leaking pipe," she said. "The maintenance man has influenza, and the kitchen ceiling has begun expressing its feelings."
"I am not a plumber."
"You own 3 pipe wrenches."
"My father owned 3 pipe wrenches."
"And unless he intends to rise and use them, I believe they have passed to you."
Ethan looked toward Scout, who watched from behind the sofa with his chin resting on a stolen navy blue sock. Leaving the puppy alone still felt wrong, though Ruth had assured him that a quiet hour could be healthy. Ethan set fresh water down, checked the back door twice, and followed Helen across town. Willow House occupied a red brick building near an old Methodist church, its white trim peeling and its gutters sagging beneath last season's leaves. Inside, the air smelled of vegetable soup, furniture polish, and coffee that had been reheated once too often. The senior center's coordinator, Marjorie Pike, met them near the kitchen. Marjorie was 67, short and broad through the shoulders, with warm brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and rectangular glasses suspended from a bright red chain. She had spent most of her career managing a public library, where years of broken heating systems, shrinking budgets, and people returning books wet from bathtubs had given her a calm tolerance for emergencies. Her voice was gentle with the elderly residents, but sharpened whenever someone suggested they should simply be grateful for whatever little support remained.
"The pipe is under the sink,"
Marjorie said.
The budget is under everything else. Ethan crouched beside the cabinet and found a corroded connection dripping into a plastic basin. The repair was simple, but the room beyond the kitchen held his attention. Nearly 30 elderly residents sat at folding tables eating lunch. Some spoke in pairs, others ate alone while staring toward windows filmed with age. A thin, white-haired veteran wearing an old Navy cap carefully divided his bread roll into 4 equal pieces before eating them. 2 widows shared a crossword puzzle, disagreeing over every answer with the comfortable irritation of people who trusted one another enough to be wrong. Near the wall, a woman with swollen hands wrapped half her sandwich in a napkin and slipped it into her purse. Ethan understood immediately. She was saving it for dinner. Helen noticed where he was looking. "For some of them, this is the only hot meal of the day," she said quietly. "For others, it is the only time anyone says their name." Ethan tightened the pipe connection harder than necessary. "The county funds this place." "The county funds part of it. The rest comes from donations and people pretending old buildings do not decay." He wiped his hands and stepped into the main room. In the far corner stood an upright piano beneath a gray cloth. Dust softened its outline, and several boxes had been stacked against the bench. Helen's gaze followed his. "You taught music," Ethan said. "For 41 years. Why is the piano covered?" Helen removed her gloves 1 finger at a time. Her hands were long and elegant, though the knuckles had begun to swell with age. "Because some instruments know when they are no longer wanted." That does not sound like something a music teacher would say. It sounds like something a widow would say. Her husband, Daniel, had died 3 years earlier after a brief illness. Ethan knew that much from his father, but not the shape grief had taken afterward. Helen had conducted the Willow House Choir for almost 2 decades. Daniel had sat in the same chair at every performance, smiling as though Helen had invented music personally for his benefit. After his death, she had tried to lead one rehearsal. Halfway through the first song, she saw the empty chair and lost her place. She had closed the piano and never opened it again. Ethan looked at the covered instrument, then at the people eating beneath buzzing lights. He thought of Scout pressed behind the sofa, listening to a world he did not yet trust. "Silence can become a habit," he said. Helen studied him carefully. "Yes, and habits can pretend to be safety." When Ethan returned home, Scout was not beneath the sofa. For 1 terrible second, panic moved through him. Then he saw the puppy standing in the rectangle of sunlight near the front window. Scout's ribs were still visible beneath his black and tan coat, and his legs seemed too long for his fragile body. Yet he was fully outside the shadows. 1 ear stood upright while the other leaned sideways, and his dark eyes followed a leaf tumbling across the porch. Ethan stopped in the doorway. Scout noticed him and stiffened. Ethan lowered his gaze, moved slowly to the rug, and sat down. He opened the newspaper without speaking. After several minutes, the puppy remained near the window. That evening, Ethan attempted to move a box of his father's tools from the hallway. The weight shifted unexpectedly. Pain tore through his injured shoulder, sharp enough to blur the room. He released the box and dropped beside the sofa, one hand gripping his arm while his breathing became shallow and uneven. The pain itself was familiar. The helplessness was worse. He hated needing time, hated the body that refused commands, hated that every plan for his future depended on doctors deciding what remained useful in him. A faint scrape came from beneath the sofa. Scout emerged slowly. The puppy approached with his body low, pausing whenever Ethan's breath caught. He sniffed Ethan's open hand, then looked toward his face. Ethan remained still, afraid that even hope might frighten him away. Scout stepped closer and lowered his narrow head onto Ethan's knee. Ethan did not reach for him. He did not praise him or turn the moment into a victory. He simply sat on the floor, while the pain eased, and the puppy's warm breath moved against his hand. Trust had not arrived like a rescue. It had come quietly, on oversized paws, as one frightened creature deciding another should not be left alone. 6 weeks after Scout left the shelter, early winter settled over Staunton in clear blue mornings and brittle nights that turned every puddle along the curb into glass. The German Shepherd puppy no longer looked like the fading creature listed under case K619. His black and tan coat had begun to fill out across his narrow shoulders, the dull patches replaced by a soft sheen whenever sunlight reached him. His ribs were still visible if he stretched, but less sharply than before, and his oversized paws now carried him through the house with growing confidence. Scout had discovered a cloth ball Ruth brought during one of her visits, though his relationship with it was less athletic than accidental. He chased it bravely, stepped on it with both front paws, and usually rolled sideways into a chair leg. Ethan pretended not to laugh the first few times. By the 5th, he stopped pretending. Scout also began waiting near the kitchen doorway while Ethan prepared breakfast, never close enough to be touched, but close enough to prove the distance between them had become a choice rather than a prison. Ethan should have felt relieved. Instead, each sign of recovery made the future more difficult. A frightened puppy could be viewed as a temporary responsibility. A puppy who knew the sound of Ethan's footsteps, stole socks from only one bedroom, and slept facing the front door had begun to resemble something else. The medical review from the Navy remained unresolved. Ethan received brief messages filled with careful language. Additional assessment required, final duty status pending, possible reassignment under consideration. Each phrase widened the uncertainty. He might return to a SEAL support role, be transferred into training, or leave active service altogether. He did not know where he would live after the house sold. He did not know whether his shoulder would tolerate long workdays or whether his damaged hearing would remain a permanent barrier. A man unsure of his own future had no right promising stability to an animal who had already survived too many broken promises. Ethan repeated that argument until it sounded almost reasonable. Then Ruth called on a Thursday afternoon and told him she had found an adoptive family in Maryland. Michael and Susan Porter arrived 2 days later for an initial meeting. Michael was 58, tall and slightly stooped, with a long, weathered face, thinning gray hair, and a neatly clipped mustache. He had worked 30 years as a high school guidance counselor, and his habit of listening without interruption made people speak more honestly than they intended. Susan, 55, had a sturdy build, pale skin touched by winter redness, and thick chestnut hair streaked with silver, worn in a loose braid down her back. She managed a small garden center and possessed the calm patience of someone accustomed to coaxing life from damaged roots. The Porters had owned 2 German Shepherds during their marriage, both of whom had lived into old age. Their property outside Frederick included 6 fenced acres, a heated mudroom, and no young children. On paper, they were perfect. Ruth reviewed their records at Ethan's kitchen table, while Scout watched from the hallway. The puppy did not retreat behind the sofa, but he refused to cross into the room. Susan sat sideways in her chair rather than facing him directly. Michael kept both hands resting on his knees. Neither called his name or offered food too quickly. Ethan noticed every correct choice and resented them for making the decision harder. "He would have space," Ruth said quietly after the Porters stepped outside to inspect the yard. "He would have experience," Ethan replied. "And permanence." Ethan looked toward the hallway. Scout's one upright ear remained fixed on his voice. "That is what he needs." Ruth studied Ethan's expression. "Is that what he needs? Or what makes leaving easier for you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "My orders could change with one phone call." "So could anyone's life." "That is not an answer." "No," Ruth said. "It is simply the part nobody likes admitting." Across town, Helen stood at the front of Willow House holding the letter she had hidden for nearly 3 weeks. The main room was crowded for lunch, yet an uneasy silence followed her announcement. The roof required immediate repair. The heating system was failing. Without funding, the center might close before the end of winter. Helen expected questions. She did not expect the look of betrayal on some familiar faces. "You knew?" asked Walter Briggs, a 76-year-old Navy veteran with a thin frame, a deeply lined face, and white hair cut close beneath his faded service cap. Walter had spent most of his adult life repairing railroad signals and disliked surprises, because one unexpected failure had once cost a coworker his leg. "You let us keep coming here while the place was already dying?" "I was trying to find another answer first," Helen said. "You were deciding what we could handle." At a nearby table, two widows began gathering their belongings. One wrapped a framed wedding photograph in a scarf. Another slipped her favorite blue coffee mug into her handbag. Their movements were quiet, but the room seemed louder because of them. People did not always leave only when a door closed. Sometimes they began departing the moment they feared it might. Ethan arrived later with his father's toolbox, expecting only to inspect the roof. He found Helen sitting alone near the covered piano, the letter folded in her lap. For once, she had no clever remark ready. Ethan climbed into the attic with Marjorie and examined the rafters beneath the damaged section. Several boards had rotted, but the structure remained sound. The repair would require volunteers, lumber, and patience, all of which seemed possible. The heating system was another matter. The furnace was old enough to have become a local legend and nearly as stubborn. Replacing it would cost more than Willow House had raised in the previous 2 years. "The roof can be saved," Ethan said when he returned downstairs. Helen looked toward the people carrying personal belongings to their cars. "That may not be enough." Ethan understood. A building could remain standing and still lose the faith that made it a home. That evening, the Porters returned for the formal adoption meeting. Susan had brought a soft green blanket. Michael carried a new leather collar, plain and strong. They were kind, prepared, and careful. Scout watched them from beside the sofa, his body tense but not panicked. Ethan told himself this was progress. He told himself good decisions often hurt. When Susan knelt several feet away and placed the blanket on the floor, Scout backed toward Ethan's chair. Michael looked at the puppy, then at Ethan, and something thoughtful passed across his face. "We can give him a good life," Michael said gently, "but I'm not sure he is asking us for one." Ethan turned away to retrieve the folder Ruth had left on the desk. His navy jacket hung across the back of a chair. Before anyone could move, Scout reached up, caught the sleeve between his teeth, and pulled the jacket to the floor. Then he dragged it toward the corner and curled inside the camouflage fabric, making himself small again. The brightness disappeared from his eyes. Ethan saw K619 pressed against the shelter wall, waiting for another world to decide where he belonged. The Porters remained silent. Ruth did not interfere. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside Scout. His injured shoulder protested, but he barely noticed. The puppy looked up without releasing the sleeve. "Hearing me say this does not make it sensible," Ethan murmured. Ruth folded her arms. "Most important decisions are not improved by pretending they're convenient." Ethan placed his hand on the floor beside Scout, close enough to offer but not demand. "Cancel the adoption." Susan's face softened rather than fell. Michael nodded once, as though Ethan had finally answered a question everyone else already understood. Ethan looked at Ruth. He does not need a better house. He needs the home he already chose. Scout did not climb into Ethan's arms or suddenly become fearless. He only lowered his chin onto the sleeve of the navy jacket and closed his eyes. For the first time, Ethan understood that home was not always the safest building, the largest yard, or the most perfect plan. Sometimes it was simply the place where a frightened heart had finally learned which footsteps returned. Winter sunlight lay thin and bright across Staunton, Virginia, while a cold wind moved through the bare trees and worried at the loose boards along the Cole property. 3 days after canceling Scout's adoption, Ethan signed the final rescue papers at his kitchen table. The document described the 9-week-old German Shepherd as a permanent placement, though the word permanent made Ethan pause before writing his name. Permanence had once meant orders, teammates, and duties that continued until someone officially relieved him. Now it meant food bills, veterinary appointments, muddy paws, at a living creature who had chosen him without knowing whether Ethan's shoulder would heal or whether the Navy would keep him. Ruth watched him sign without offering congratulations. She understood that Ethan disliked ceremony around decisions that frightened him. Instead, she handed over Scout's medical folder and said, "He will need patience, structure, and someone who notices when structure becomes pressure." Ethan looked toward the living room, where Scout was attempting to carry a cloth ball and a stolen sock at the same time. "That sounds unnecessarily complicated," he said. Ruth glanced at the puppy as Scout tripped over the ball and disappeared behind the armchair. "Most worthwhile things are." Ethan spent the next week preparing the house as if it were a small operational site. He repaired the backyard fence, reinforced the gate, moved cleaning chemicals into locked cabinets, and built a quiet sleeping corner beneath the stairs with a padded bed and 2 blankets. Because Scout's legs still slipped on polished wood, Ethan placed long rubber-backed rugs from the living room to the kitchen. He arranged them with military precision, only to discover that Scout preferred lying half on a rug and half off it, as though refusing to endorse the full plan. The puppy's confidence expanded faster than his coordination. He began trotting after Ethan from room to room, stopping several feet away whenever the man turned around. He investigated paper bags, challenged his reflection in the dark television screen, and stole one gardening glove from the porch before falling asleep with his nose inside it. His growing curiosity also produced damage. Ethan found the television remote beneath the dining table with 3 buttons missing. A corner of the mustard-yellow sofa had been opened like a poorly wrapped gift, releasing a cloud of stuffing across the carpet. Scout sat in the center of it with a white tuft stuck to one upright ear, looking less guilty than surprised by the weather he had created indoors. Ethan closed his eyes, counted slowly, and reminded himself that furniture could be repaired. The remote, however, appeared to have died in service. Laura Cole arrived from Richmond on Saturday morning, while Ethan was attaching wire mesh along the bottom of the backyard fence. At 43, Laura was 4 years older than her brother and carried herself with the composed efficiency of the rehabilitation nurse she had become. She was medium height and lean, with fair skin, straight dark brown hair cut just below her chin, and gray-green eyes that matched Ethan's, but revealed concern more quickly. Fine lines had formed around her mouth from years of pressing back remarks, until she could deliver them politely. Laura had spent much of adulthood caring for patients who believed strength meant refusing help, and her brother remained the most stubborn example she had ever encountered. She stepped through the gate wearing a navy wool coat and practical boots, carrying 2 grocery bags and a look Ethan recognized from childhood. "You adopted him," she said. It was not a question. Scout stood behind Ethan's legs, watching the unfamiliar woman without hiding. "I completed the paperwork," Ethan replied. "That is generally what adoption means." Laura placed the groceries on the porch. "Last month you said you might be transferred. 2 weeks ago you were selling the house. Yesterday Helen told me you were repairing a senior center." Ethan tightened the fencing staple harder than necessary. "Helen called you?" "Helen believes family members should receive warnings before their relatives attempt to solve an entire town." Laura entered the house and studied its changes. The rugs, the puppy bed, the damaged sofa, and the duffel bag still resting beside the armchair instead of unpacked upstairs. Ethan expected criticism about Scout. Instead, Laura crouched at a respectful distance and turned one shoulder toward the puppy. Scout crept close enough to smell her glove before withdrawing. "He is beautiful," she said. "He is recovering." "So are you." Ethan stood too quickly, irritation rising at the familiar implication that his life had become a medical condition. Laura followed him into the kitchen. She asked about the Navy review, his shoulder therapy, and whether he had considered the administrative position a former colleague mentioned. Ethan answered each question with fewer words than the one before. When Laura asked why he had spent 2 days inspecting Willow House instead of preparing the property for sale, his restraint broke. "Because their roof leaks and their furnace is failing," he said. "That does not answer why it has to be you." "Someone has to do it." Laura folded her arms.
That has been your answer since you were 19. Someone has to carry the equipment. Someone has to stay awake.
Someone has to go back. You became a Navy SEAL because you believed being useful meant never being the person who needed rescuing. Ethan's face hardened. You came here to help or to lecture me? I came because you adopted a frightened dog, started rebuilding a community center, and still have not unpacked your bag. You know how to bring everyone else out of danger, Ethan. You have no idea how to say when you are the one who cannot find the door. The argument ended without resolution. Laura left the groceries and drove back toward Richmond before dusk, her anger tempered by the knowledge that some truths could only be delivered, not accepted on schedule. Ethan remained outside, repairing what did not require conversation. Scout followed him into the backyard, carrying the ruined television remote like a trophy. Near the fence stood the flower bed Ethan's father had planted 25 years earlier. Thomas Cole had never been sentimental in speech, but every spring he grew red tulips because Ethan's mother had loved them. Their bulbs now slept beneath the frozen soil, waiting for a season Ethan's father would never see. Ethan turned away for less than 10 minutes. When he looked back, Scout had dug a deep hole in the center of the bed. Soil covered the puppy's muzzle, chest, and paws. A chewed tulip bulb rested beside him. "Scout!" The shout cracked across the yard. Scout dropped instantly, his belly pressed against the dirt, ears flattened, eyes wide and vacant. The puppy did not look like a mischievous dog caught digging. He looked like K619 waiting for punishment in a metal cage. Ethan's anger vanished so quickly that shame took its place. He saw what the puppy saw, a large man standing over him, voice raised, shovel in hand. Ethan lowered the shovel and moved several feet away before sitting on the cold ground. His injured shoulder pulled painfully, but he did not shift closer. "I am sorry," he said, keeping his voice level. "You did not know, and I should have known better." Scout remained motionless. Ethan waited. The wind moved dry leaves along the fence. After several minutes, Scout raised his head. He did not come to Ethan, but he stopped trembling. Ethan looked at the ruined flower bed and imagined his father declaring the disaster beyond repair. Then he imagined his mother laughing because one tulip bed had finally defeated both Cole men. "We will plant something else," Ethan told the puppy. That night, a violent storm rolled through the Shenandoah Valley. Thunder shook the windows, and rain struck the roof in hard silver sheets. Ethan woke on the sofa with no memory of falling asleep. A burst of thunder tore through his damaged hearing as a distorted explosion. For several seconds, the living room disappeared beneath another place, another night. Another sound his body remembered more clearly than his mind wished to. He reached for the floor, breathing too quickly, unable to orient himself. Then Scout climbed onto the sofa. The puppy hesitated only once before placing both front paws against Ethan's chest and lowering his entire body across him. Scout's heartbeat fluttered rapidly beneath his thin ribs, but he stayed. Ethan rested one hand along the puppy's back without gripping. Gradually, the room returned. The yellow sofa, the dark television, the rain at the windows, the smell of wet earth through an old frame. By morning, the storm had passed. Helen stood at her kitchen window across the street, holding a cup of coffee between both hands. Through Ethan's uncovered window, she could see the Navy SEAL asleep on the sofa, one arm curved protectively around the German Shepherd puppy stretched across his chest. Helen had lived long enough to recognize that appearances often told stories backward. The town would say Ethan had brought Scout home to heal him. From where Helen stood, it looked very much as though Scout had spent the night guarding the man who had carried him out. A cold, clear morning settled over Staunton, Virginia, leaving silver frost on the lawns and a thin blue light across the Shenandoah Valley. 3 days after the storm, Ethan stood in the kitchen fastening a simple black leash to Scout's collar, while the young German Shepherd watched every movement with cautious suspicion. Scout had gained enough weight for his narrow body to look less fragile, and the black saddle of his coat had begun to shine against the warmer tan fur along his chest and legs. One ear now stood almost permanently upright, while the other still leaned sideways whenever he was uncertain. The uneven ears gave him an expression that was both serious and faintly ridiculous, as though half of him were prepared for duty while the other half had slept through the briefing. Helen had asked Ethan to bring Scout to Willow House for one short visit. Ethan had refused twice before agreeing to 30 minutes. "He is not a therapy dog," he reminded her as they crossed the parking lot. Helen, wearing a deep green coat over a cream blouse, walked beside them with the dignified slowness of someone unwilling to admit the cold had stiffened her knees. "Neither am I," she replied. "Yet people keep expecting me to listen." Willow House sounded different to Scout than the Cole home. Wheelchair brakes clicked against tile. Wooden canes tapped in uneven rhythms. Coffee cups struck saucers, chairs scraped, and several conversations overlapped beneath the steady hum of the old furnace. Scout stopped inside the doorway, lowered his body, and glanced back toward the parking lot. Ethan felt the leash tighten in his hand. His first instinct was to guide the puppy forward, but he remembered the empty look that had returned when Scout heard him shout in the garden. He loosened the leash instead. "We can stand here," he said quietly. Scout looked up at him, then turned one upright ear toward the room. Marjorie Pike had arranged a quiet corner near the wall with water, a folded blanket, and enough distance from the lunch tables to prevent Scout from feeling surrounded. She greeted Ethan with her rectangular glasses hanging from their bright red chain and a clipboard pressed against her broad chest. "A development company made an offer on the building," she said before he could ask how she was. "They want the land for furnished retirement apartments." Ethan looked around Willow House. "This already serves retired people." "These apartments would serve retired people with better bank accounts." The offer had come from Blue Ridge Heritage Properties, represented by Grant Whitaker, a 54-year-old development consultant with a lean frame, carefully combed silver-brown hair, and a narrow, clean-shaven face that rarely revealed whether he was pleased or irritated. Grant had grown up in Staunton and learned early that respectable language could make harsh decisions sound reasonable. He did not call the possible buyers wealthy. He called them financially independent. He did not describe Willow House as a home for isolated seniors. He referred to it as an underperforming municipal property. That morning, Grant sat with 2 town council members at a table near the front, speaking in a calm voice about tax revenue, renovation costs, and responsible use of community assets. One council member, Patricia Dunn, listened with visible agreement. Patricia was 61, a tall, narrow woman with pale skin, short blonde hair turning white at the temples, and a wardrobe of dark, tailored suits that made her seem permanently prepared for a courtroom. She had spent 25 years managing county budgets and believed numbers were kinder than people because numbers did not accuse anyone of betrayal. "We cannot preserve every old building because it holds memories," she said. "At some point, sentiment becomes a luxury." Walter Briggs heard her. The elderly Navy veteran sat straighter beneath his faded service cap. "Funny," he muttered. "How sentiment becomes a luxury only after someone else's memories are in the way." Ethan remained near Scout, but the words reached him. He understood Patricia's argument more than he wanted to. Buildings cost money. Heating systems failed. Good intentions did not produce fuel or lumber. Yet he also remembered the woman who had hidden half a sandwich for dinner and the way the widows had begun carrying their belongings home after Helen's announcement. People treated places differently once they believed the world had decided those places were unnecessary. Scout took 3 cautious steps into the room. A walker rolled past, its metal frame rattling when one wheel struck a floor seam. Scout flinched and pressed against Ethan's leg. Ethan lowered one hand beside his thigh, but did not touch him. "You decide," he whispered. Near the far window sat Margaret Lewis. At 83, Margaret had a small, delicate frame wrapped in a lavender cardigan,
with smooth, dark brown skin, high cheekbones, and fine white hair braided into a short crown around her head. Her posture remained elegant despite arthritis that had curved her fingers inward. Margaret had once owned a dress shop with her husband Samuel, and was remembered for telling nervous brides that no gown could rescue a bad decision, but a good hem could at least prevent a public fall. After Samuel died 8 months earlier, Margaret continued coming to Willow House because Marjorie sent a volunteer to collect her. She ate, listened, and left without speaking more than a few words. For nearly 6 months, no one had heard her laugh. Margaret's silence made people uncomfortable. Some filled it with cheerful questions. Others spoke too loudly, as if grief were a hearing problem. Scout did neither. He noticed her shoes. The shoes were soft brown leather, polished but worn at the toes.
Scout moved toward them slowly, stopping twice to look back at Ethan. Margaret did not reach down. Her eyes followed him with a stillness that differed from fear. Scout sniffed the edge of her skirt, circled once, then lowered himself onto the floor and placed his narrow muzzle across both shoes. The room did not become silent, but the space around Margaret seemed to. Her hands remained folded in her lap, one thumb moved slightly against the other. "He did not ask permission," Patricia observed from across the room. "Dogs rarely understand committees," Walter replied. Margaret looked down at Scout. The puppy's eyes had closed, though one ear remained turned toward the surrounding noise. Ethan recognized the posture. Scout was resting but not fully surrendering to safety. A part of him still stood watch. Laura arrived shortly before noon carrying a manila folder. She wore charcoal trousers, a burgundy sweater, and the controlled expression that usually meant she had already considered every objection Ethan might make. She greeted Helen, nodded to Marjorie, and handed the folder to her brother. Inside was information about an administrative position at a Navy medical facility outside Richmond. The role involved coordinating rehabilitation appointments for injured service members. It offered stable hours, reliable pay, and a furnished apartment that allowed dogs. "You arranged all this?" Ethan asked. "I made 2 calls. You had no right." "I found an option. I did not sign your name." Ethan looked toward Scout and Margaret. "You think moving me into an office fixes everything?" "No," Laura said. "I think having health insurance, physical therapy, and a roof you are not personally repairing might help." Her voice was firm, but worry softened her eyes. She had seen too many patients mistake uncertainty for freedom and exhaustion for purpose. Ethan understood that her interference came from love. That did not make it easier to accept. Before he could answer, Margaret spoke. "This boy does not like rooms that are too quiet either." Her voice was low and slightly rough from disuse. Several conversations stopped. Margaret did not appear to notice. She lifted one hand, hesitated, then rested 2 fingertips lightly between Scout's ears. The puppy opened his eyes but did not move away. Helen turned toward the covered piano. Something in Margaret's sentence had crossed the room and found the place where Helen kept her own silence. She walked to the instrument, removed the gray cloth, and folded it across the bench. Dust rose in the winter light. Her hands trembled as she opened the lid. She sat without looking toward the chair where Daniel had once listened. The first note came softly, imperfect after 3 years. Then another followed. Helen began a simple hymn she had taught to children who were afraid of singing alone. Scout raised his head. He listened for several seconds, drew in a breath, and released a long, uneven howl that missed nearly every note. Walter laughed first. Marjorie covered her mouth. Even Patricia's carefully composed expression cracked. Margaret's laughter emerged slowly, rusty at the beginning, then bright enough to fill the room. Helen continued playing. The laughter did not repair the roof. It did not replace the furnace, reject the development offer, or choose Ethan's future for him. But for one winter morning, no one gathered belongings to take home. No one described Willow House as underperforming. And beneath the piano's uncertain melody, Scout lay beside Margaret as though keeping a door open that grief had nearly closed. A pale winter sun rose over Staunton, Virginia, turning the frost along the willow house windows into thin silver branches. Inside, the old building had awakened before daylight. Folding tables filled the main hall. Strands of warm bulbs hung beneath the ceiling, and the kitchen smelled of roasted chicken, cinnamon apples, and coffee strong enough to restore faith in poor decisions. The fundraiser had been named the Second Watch Supper because Walter Briggs said every sailor understood that the hardest hours often came after midnight, when people were tired and someone still had to remain awake. The evening would include a community meal, photographs of local veterans, music from Helen, and a presentation about rescued animals that needed foster homes. Ethan had designed the floor plan with the precision of a Navy operation. Wide paths for wheelchairs, emergency exits left clear, quiet seating near the walls, and a small recovery area where Scout could retreat if the noise became overwhelming. Scout, now nearly 4 months old, had gained strength across his shoulders and legs, though his paws remained comically large and one ear still leaned sideways whenever he was confused. He followed Ethan through the hall, wearing a plain blue bandana, occasionally inspecting boxes and carrying away anything small enough to fit in his mouth. Ethan would not be there for the beginning. His final medical evaluation had been scheduled for that same morning at a regional military clinic outside Richmond. He had tried to move the appointment, but the Navy had already delayed the review twice. Before leaving, he checked every door, handed Marjorie a written schedule, reminded Ruth where Scout's quiet corner was, and asked Laura 3 times whether the first aid station had enough supplies. Laura finally placed both hands on her brother's shoulders and turned him toward the exit. "Go learn what the Navy has decided," she said. "We can serve soup without tactical supervision." Ethan glanced back at Scout. The young German shepherd stood beside Helen, holding one of Ethan's old training gloves in his mouth. Ethan had lost the glove weeks earlier and assumed Scout had buried it with the missing socks. "Keep him out of the kitchen," Ethan said. "That instruction applies equally to Walter," Laura replied. At the clinic, Ethan sat beneath fluorescent lights that flattened every face into the same tired shade. Across the desk was Commander David Mercer, a 52-year-old Navy physician with a solid build, dark skin, closely shaved gray hair, and a square, clean-shaven face softened by patient brown eyes. Mercer had served with expeditionary medical units before a spinal injury ended his own field career. The experience had made him careful with service members who heard medical limitations as personal accusations. He reviewed Ethan's scans, hearing tests, surgical reports, and months of physical therapy before closing the folder. "Your shoulder has improved," Mercer said, "but not enough for sustained combat operations. The hearing loss in your left ear creates an additional operational risk." Ethan looked at the insignia on Mercer's uniform, rather than the man's face. "So I am finished with the teams." Mercer did not hide behind softer language. "You are no longer medically qualified for direct combat deployment as a Navy SEAL." The sentence landed without drama. No alarms sounded. No one entered to remove Ethan's uniform. Yet something inside him seemed to lose its shape. He had prepared for injury, death, and orders that sent him across oceans. He had never prepared for being told he could remain alive but not return as the man he had been. Mercer allowed the silence to stand. Then he opened another folder. The Navy was offering Ethan an instructional position in tactical first aid and rehabilitation support for service members returning from deployment. He would train younger personnel, help injured sailors understand their recovery plans, and work with families learning how to live around changes no one had chosen. "It is not a ceremonial desk," Mercer said. "The program needs someone who knows what happens before the ambulance arrives and after everyone stops calling the injured man a hero." Ethan studied the pages. "It is not the job I trained for." Mercer leaned back carefully, protecting the injury that still troubled him after 13 years. "Neither was this one for me. That does not make it useless." At Willow House, Laura organized the free health station with the calm authority of a rehabilitation nurse who had learned that older patients answered honest questions only after deciding they would not be rushed. She checked blood pressure, reviewed medications, and discovered that Walter had been cutting one tablet in half to make the prescription last longer. She did not scold him. She wrote down the pharmacy number and promised to help. Watching the room fill, Laura began to understand what Ethan had been building. He had not attached himself to Willow House because he lacked somewhere else to go. He had seen an endangered place and recognized people who had begun to believe they were burdens. Repairing the building gave him a way to answer that belief without speaking about his own. By late afternoon, cars lined both sides of the street. The local newspaper sent a photographer.
Families brought casseroles. Veterans carried framed service photographs. And several people who had not visited Willow House in years arrived because they had heard about Scout. Michael and Susan Porter drove from Maryland with bags of dog food and refused to accept praise for coming. Margaret Lewis sat near the piano in her lavender cardigan, Scout resting beneath her chair whenever the room grew too loud. Grant Whitaker attended in a dark overcoat and maintained the polite expression of a man gathering information. Patricia Dunn stood near the entrance, studying the crowd, as if recalculating every argument she had made about underused property. Helen waited behind the curtain beside the small stage. She wore a midnight blue dress that fell softly over her slender frame, and her silver curls had been pinned neatly above the collar. Her hands were cold, despite the warmth of the room. Through the opening, she could see the piano and the rows of chairs. The chair in the front left corner remained empty. Daniel had always sat there, leaning forward with his hands clasped, smiling before she played the first note. Helen had believed 3 years would make the empty chair smaller. Instead, the crowd seemed to bend around it. "I cannot do this," she whispered. Margaret stood beside her, one hand resting on a polished wooden cane. "Then do not play for the chair." Helen looked at her. "Play for everyone still sitting." When Helen walked onto the stage, conversation softened. She sat at the piano but did not begin immediately. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then Scout gave a low, questioning chirp from beneath Margaret's chair. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room. Helen smiled, placed her hands on the keyboard, and began. The first measures were cautious, but the melody strengthened as voices joined. Laura watched from the health table and saw Helen glance once at Daniel's empty chair, then toward the living faces beyond it. Grief had not released her. She had simply made room beside it for music. Ethan returned after darkness had covered the windows. He entered quietly, carrying the medical board folder beneath one arm. Scout saw him before anyone else did. The puppy sprang from beside Margaret, raced across the hall with Ethan's old training gloves still in his mouth, and nearly collided with a table before skidding to a stop at Ethan's boots. Ethan crouched despite the pull in his shoulder. Scout pressed against him, tail striking the floor. Marjorie approached, holding a letter from the Shenandoah Community Foundation. Donations from the supper, combined with the crowd, volunteer commitments, and renewed community support, had qualified Willow House for a matching preservation grant. The money would not solve every problem, but it would cover the furnace and protect the building from immediate sale. Ruth knelt beside Scout and watched him remain calm as strangers passed within several feet. "He is ready to begin supervised training as a community visiting dog," she said. "Slowly. No pressure. He may never be perfect." Ethan looked at the folder under his arm, then at Scout's uneven ears and proudly stolen glove. "Neither will I." He rested a hand lightly between the puppy's shoulders. "Maybe neither of us can do the old job anymore. That does not mean there is no work left for us." 1 year after the date printed on case K619, winter returned to Staunton, Virginia, beneath a clear white sky. Snow rested on the roofs along Sycamore Street, softened the stone walls of Willow House, and covered the Blue Ridge foothills in quiet folds. Inside the senior center, the new heating system hummed with the steady confidence of machinery that had not yet learned bad habits.
The roof no longer leaked over the kitchen, the windows had been sealed, and a brass plaque beside the entrance thanked the volunteers who had helped preserve the building. No one had included Ethan Cole's name in larger letters than anyone else's. That had been his condition for accepting the plaque at all. Scout entered Willow House through the red front door with his leash loose between Ethan's fingers. At 14 months old, the German Shepherd no longer resembled the skeletal puppy who had once pressed himself against a shelter wall. His chest had broadened, strong muscles moved beneath his glossy black and tan coat, and both ears now stood upright, most of the time. The right one still leaned sideways when he heard something confusing, which happened whenever Walter told a joke. Scout wore a simple blue vest identifying him as a community visiting dog. He had completed months of supervised training with Ruth, though everyone understood that his greatest skill had never come from commands. Scout noticed loneliness before most people admitted feeling it. He moved slowly past walkers and wheelchairs, greeting familiar residents without climbing onto laps or demanding attention. Margaret Lewis sat behind the reception desk in a lavender cardigan, sorting name tags into alphabetical order. She had placed her reading glasses somewhere and was searching beneath a stack of lunch menus. "They are on your head?" Ethan said. Margaret touched her white braided crown and found the glasses resting there.
"I knew that,"
she replied. "I was checking whether you remained observant enough to work for the Navy." Scout stopped beside her chair and rested his muzzle on the desk. Margaret scratched between his ears. A year earlier, she had barely spoken. Now she welcomed visitors, corrected Walter's exaggerated military stories, and kept a jar of dog treats in the drawer marked office supplies. She claimed the label was technically accurate because Scout improved office morale. The room beyond the desk had changed as well. One former storage area had become a veteran's lounge with sturdy chairs, warm lamps, shelves of donated books, and framed photographs of local service members. Some of the veterans came for organized meetings. Others simply sat with coffee beside people who understood that difficult memories did not always require explanation. Scout often chose the quietest person in the room and settled nearby. He never forced a hand to reach for him. He only made the distance feel less final. Helen Carter played the piano every Wednesday afternoon. Her silver curls were pinned behind her head, and her long hands moved more confidently than they had during the first second watch supper. She still noticed the chair where Daniel had once sat. Grief had not vanished, nor had she expected it to. It had simply stopped occupying every chair in the room. On that winter morning, Helen led a group through an old hymn while Scout slept beneath the piano bench. When the singers reached the final note, Scout lifted his head and produced a low howl several steps away from the melody. Helen looked down at him. "A year of training and you still refuse to respect the key." Scout wagged his tail against the floor. "You sound like Walter after 2 cups of coffee," Margaret called from reception. Laughter moved through Willow House, with the ease of something that had learned it was welcome there. Ethan watched from the doorway. He was 40 now, still tall and broad-shouldered, though the strain around his gray-green eyes had softened. Gray showed more clearly at his temples, and his closely trimmed beard carried a few silver threads. His injured shoulder would never regain its former strength, and the hearing loss in his left ear remained. He wore his hearing device without trying to conceal it. Some days the distorted sounds still exhausted him. Some nights he still woke before dawn without knowing what had pulled him from sleep. Recovery had not transformed him into the man he had been before the injury. It had taught him to stop treating that earlier man as the only version worth becoming. The Navy had assigned Ethan to a part-time tactical first aid training program that allowed him to remain in Staunton. Twice each week, he instructed younger sailors and medical personnel in emergency response, emphasizing not only how to keep someone alive in the first minutes of crisis, but how to speak to injured service members afterward. He had learned that survival could feel like another order a person did not know how to follow. On other days, he assisted Ruth with foster home evaluations and helped frightened rescue dogs adjust to calm routines. He was particularly good with people who insisted they did not need instructions, and dogs who hid behind furniture. Experience, he had discovered, occasionally became wisdom after embarrassing itself for long enough. The old coal house was no longer listed for sale. Ethan had unpacked the duffel bag that once waited beside the armchair, though Scout had immediately stolen 2 socks from the open drawer. The backyard fence stood firm, and the ruined flower bed had been replanted with red tulips. In spring, the first bloom had appeared beside the exact place Scout once dug his hole. Ethan had taken a photograph and sent it to Laura with the message, "Apparently destruction was part of the landscaping plan." Laura now visited Staunton twice each month to conduct free health screenings at Willow House. She checked blood pressure, reviewed medications, and helped residents find affordable services. She no longer arrived carrying job applications or plans for Ethan's relocation. The change between brother and sister had not come through one dramatic apology. It grew through smaller acts, Ethan answering her calls, Laura allowing a silence to remain without filling it with advice, both of them learning that concern did not have to become control. That evening, after Willow House closed, Ethan and Scout walked home through light snow. Scout stopped at every familiar gate, inspecting footprints and lifting his face toward the falling flakes. At the coal house, Ethan removed the blue vest, dried Scout's paws, and reheated a bowl of soup Helen had sent across the street. The living room held the comfortable disorder of a place being lived in. A training manual lay open on the coffee table. Dog hair gathered stubbornly along the rug. The mustard-yellow sofa still bore a repaired corner where Scout had once released the stuffing like an indoor snowstorm. Ethan sat down, intending to rest for several minutes. Scout jumped beside him, turned 3 deliberate circles, and lowered his long body across Ethan's chest. The position had become increasingly impractical as Scout grew, but neither seemed willing to revise the arrangement. Ethan placed one arm around the German Shepherd and closed his eyes. Across the street, Helen noticed the living room light. She carried over an apple pie still warm beneath a cloth and let herself in after knocking softly. Ethan was asleep on the sofa, his face peaceful beneath the warm lamp. Scout opened one brown eye, recognized her, and lowered his head again. Helen set the pie on the kitchen counter and pulled a blanket across them both. On the table lay a copy of Scout's original shelter record, K-619. Euthanasia scheduled 2 p.m., November 18th. Beneath it, in Ruth's firm handwriting, were 4 additional words. Canceled. Permanent home found. Outside, snow covered the Shenandoah Valley. Inside, Scout snored softly on the sofa whose corner he had once destroyed. No one in that house had been completely healed. Ethan still carried pain in his shoulder and memories that sometimes returned without permission. Scout still disliked doors that slammed and metal bowls dropped on hard floors. Helen still missed Daniel when music reached certain notes. But the Navy SEAL had stopped packing his life into a duffel bag. The dog no longer slept against a wall. And at Willow House, the lights remained on. So anyone who had lost the road could see that somewhere ahead, a door was still waiting to open. Scout's story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder, signs, or perfect timing. Sometimes they come as one phone call, one open door, or one frightened animal placing his head on the knee of someone who thought he had nothing left to give. Ethan believed his worth came from the missions he could complete. Scout believed safety could disappear at any moment. God did not erase their wounds. He placed them beside each other and gave both of them a reason to stay. That may be one of the quietest forms of grace, not removing every pain, but sending someone who helps us carry it. In everyday life, we often judge people by what they can still do, how useful they appear, or how quickly they recover. This story asks us to look deeper. A person who seems distant may be afraid. An animal that refuses affection may still be learning trust. Healing often begins when patience replaces pressure. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Tell us in the comments what part touched you most, and subscribe for more stories of courage, mercy, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, and remind you that no life is ever beyond His care.